Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night, and feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. Midday on August the 24th, a D-79 opened over Pompeii like any other noon along the Bay of Naples, bright, warm, almost too tranquil for anyone to suspect that within a matter of hours, the entire rhythm of life would be pulled out of its familiar current and held there, suspended for nearly 2,000 years. At the foot of Vesuvius, the city rested beneath Mediterranean light, its stone-paved streets still holding the morning's warmth, its walls washed in the pale gold of late summer, its courtyards open, its shops alive with movement, its bargaining unfinished, its small conversations continuing as though this were nothing more than another ordinary day in the ancient Roman world, a day so familiar that no one thought to remember it. It was precisely that ordinary stillness that made what followed so strange, almost unreal. For the sky did not change in the way people fear. It did not split open with a first thunderous blast, did not suddenly turn light into darkness, but shifted slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the daylight were being withdrawn layer by layer, so thinly that the human eye could only recognize it when it was already too late. The sunlight grew dimmer, not quite darker, only as if passing through an unseen veil of dust suspended somewhere high above. The air remained, the streets remained, voices still lingered, yet everything seemed to carry an added weight, something unnamed. A silence that was not entirely silence, a pressure without form that could nonetheless be felt within the chest. From the direction of Vesuvius, a vast column of cloud began to rise. It was unlike rain clouds, unlike smoke, unlike sea mist, but rather like a dark grey trunk thrust upward from the mountain itself, widening as it climbed until it spread into a great canopy suspended in the sky. The sight felt both distant and near, immense as a disturbance in the heavens, yet concrete as something advancing toward human life at a speed not yet understood. The most unsettling thing was not the absence of a great initial shock, for nothing had yet shattered the habits of daily life. The true unease lay in the sense that time itself had changed its nature, still moving, yet no longer as before, still advancing, yet heavier, slower, denser, as though each moment were being stretched in the open daylight. Pompeii at that moment was not a small settlement on the edge of empire. It was a living city, densely inhabited, intricately structured, with a population estimated between 10 and 20,000, large enough to form a world of its own beneath the volcano while still believing in its own stability. Its streets wove together into a clear network. Its public baths pulsed like the social heart. Its markets spread news as swiftly as goods. Its theatres held laughter, dialogue, the footsteps of a community accustomed to shared rhythms. Near the Sarno River, near the Bay of Naples, Pompeii thrived on trade, on movement, on the constant flow between sea, land, and neighbouring cities of Campania. There were merchants weighing goods, slaves carrying loads through narrow passages, families preparing their midday meals, craftsmen pausing mid-work, children growing up amid the steady sound of urban life, in a Roman city mature enough to believe itself enduring. That city was not empty, it was not silent, it was not a ruin awaiting discovery. It was a human ecosystem where labour, rest, commerce, ritual, ambition, and daily need coexisted within what seemed an ordered stability. And so what was about to happen was not merely the destruction of stone, wood, and tile, but the sudden severing of countless lives unfolding at once, as though an unseen hand had touched the clock of the entire city, not to stop it, but to shift everything that followed out of the present. Then ash began to fall, pumice began to fall, not all at once, not in a single blow, but in layers, over hours, in waves, as though the sky were turning itself into earth and pouring down piece by piece upon the city. Volcanic material spread across rooftops, courtyards, streets, thresholds, shoulders, across every surface that sunlight had touched only moments before. In time, this blanket would reach depths of 4 to 6 meters, enough to swallow an entire city beneath a new geological layer. It was this slow, steady descent that made it merciless. For Pompeii was not erased in an instant. It was buried in stages. Ash fell. Material gathered. Weight increased. Structures strained. Roofs collapsed. Living spaces shrank. Streets vanished. The city was gradually sealed within the very moment it still existed. What buried Pompeii cannot be understood merely as fire. Vesuvius was capable of a Plinian eruption, powerful enough to drive a towering column of ash and debris tens of kilometers into the atmosphere. Within that column was a complex mixture of hot gases, fine ash, pumice, fragments of magma torn apart and hurled upward by pressure accumulated deep beneath the earth over centuries. From afar, the disaster might have appeared as a growing cloud, but at its core lay the physics of pressure, the chemistry of gases and minerals, the geology of a system that had silently stored energy for generations before releasing it all within a span that, in human terms, was fleeting. A city that believed itself sheltered beneath a familiar mountain was in truth living beside one of the Earth's immense engines of energy, silent across generations, until one day it revealed that silence had never meant safety. When people look at Pompeii, they often think of ruins. Look deeper, and it becomes something else, the trace of a collision between daily life and the deepest forces of the planet. On one side, hearths, markets, courtyards, painted walls, footsteps on stone. On the other, pressure beneath the earth, a column of ash rising like a dark pillar, matter falling from heights beyond human instinct. On one side, the familiar, on the other, the immeasurable. It is this contrast that turns Pompeii into more than a disaster. It becomes the place where human scale and planetary scale met, on the same day, under the same sky. Perhaps the most haunting thought lies not in what happened, but in how little might have changed it. If the ash column had slowed, even slightly, more roofs might have stood longer, more doors remained open, more decisions found a few extra minutes. If the light had lingered another hour, the city might have had a fragile chance to understand that this was not a passing dustfall, but the beginning of collapse. If Pompeii had been granted even a moment more to comprehend, would history have been different, or only clearer in its tragedy? No one knows. And because no one knows, the disaster carries the weight of chance, of fragility, of limits only recognized when one stands directly before them. Pompeii did not simply vanish. It was preserved, not in ice, but in ash, pumice, darkness, and the weight of geological time. A moment profoundly human, small, ordinary, was held almost intact across 2 millennia, as though the city had not left history but had been set aside, waiting to be opened again, to remind us that civilization can be so fragile that a single afternoon, altered in its light, is enough. The sorrow here does not cry out, it settles. It lingers in the spaces of a silent city that still holds the shape of life that once filled it. If you're listening from far away, leave a small mark in the comments, as though you too were standing beneath that sky. But before the ash fell, before the sky closed, Pompeii had once been a sunlit city, loud with trade, rich with the sense of daily life, filled with traces so human that only in their absence did history come to understand how precious they had been. Before AD 79, especially in the 1st century, Pompeii did not appear as a minor outpost beneath Vesuvius, but as a bright and living node within the economic body of Campania, where land opened to sea, where inland slopes leaned toward the Bay of Naples, where the Sarno River carried produce, wine, oil, pottery, all born from fertile plains and sent outward toward harbours and the vast exchange networks of the Mediterranean. The city stood upon ground formed from ancient lava flows, land that had once been fire, now turned into a stable foundation for homes, temples, streets, and warehouses, as though deep geological history had quietly prepared a stage upon which human life could unfold. From the farms of Campania, goods moved toward the river, from the river into the bay, from the bay into the wider web of empire, while on land, roads carried merchants, carts, slaves, livestock, and news toward the same convergence point. Ships docked, cargo was unloaded, new cargo was taken on. The movement never truly ceased, steady as the circulation of a body that never slept, ensuring that Pompeii did not live apart from the Roman world, but through its constant connection to it. From that geography rose a nearly complete Roman city, ordered and clear, its paved streets intersecting in a defined grid, its central forum holding civic, religious, and commercial power within a single space, its public baths caring for the body as part of social life, its theatres, temples, administrative buildings, markets, and workshops interwoven like the organs of a city that knew how to sustain itself. Within that structure, the wealthy lived in houses with open atriums, where light fell between columns, where painted walls carried colour across surfaces, where decoration, mosaics, statues, and finely crafted objects spoke of status and display. Not far away, the lower classes crowded into smaller homes, tighter rooms, living through craft, trade, labour, cooking, transport, repair. Beneath that visible order stood slaves and servants, rarely named in grand history, yet forming the unseen force behind daily life, from preparing meals to cleaning, from carrying water to maintaining households. What defined Pompeii was not wealth alone, but proximity between rich and poor, refined and ordinary, painted villas and noisy shops, all pressed into a dense shared space, not divided into distant zones as in modern cities. It was a complex society made visible in stone, in colour, in the street itself. Morning in Pompeii must have begun with small movements before swelling into a shared current. Shops opened their shutters, goods were arranged, bread was set out, jars stood ready, smoke, heat, the smell of food, voices calling, bargaining, footsteps striking stone, all layered into a sound not grand, but dense, a sound that exists only where people live close, work close, encounter one another daily, in hot food shops, where Roman life had already shaped a form of quick midday service. Food was kept in large jars built into masonry counters, ready to be handed to passers-by, merchants, labourers without kitchens, or those needing a quick meal before returning to work. Nearby, small workshops transformed clay, metal, wood, fabric, and human effort into daily objects. Markets opened as the city's commercial heartbeat, where food, oil, wine, fish, fruit, household goods, rumours, election news, and arguments were all exchanged within a single morning. A city is not made only of walls, roofs, columns, and squares. It is made of movement, of sound, of countless small needs that never cease among people living side by side beneath the same sun. And in Pompeii, even the walls spoke. Thousands of graffiti and inscriptions preserved on public and private surfaces have given this city something many ancient places have long lost, the direct voice of its inhabitants. There were advertisements, political slogans, campaign appeals written in the firm strokes of public life. There were also personal notes, jokes, teasing remarks, flirtations, fleeting marks of very human emotion. History often moves through great names, great laws, great battles, but Pompeii preserved the opposite, fragments of ordinary life, where an unknown individual once left a message before walking on, where a child might trace the alphabet, where a lover might leave a trace upon plaster. And so the city was built not only of stone and mortar, columns and roofs, but of words, of writing, of the human need to leave a sign that one had been here, had lived here, had laughed, loved, chosen sides, traded, existed within the shared space of the city. For this reason, when one looks at Pompeii today, the astonishment lies not only in the scale of its ruins, but in the strange completeness of an entire urban world. Houses remain, shops remain, wall paintings remain, everyday objects remain, streets, forums, baths, theatres, temples, building blocks, and living spaces survive enough to reconstruct almost the full economic, social, and cultural life of the city before its final day. Elsewhere in the ancient world, the past reaches the present through fragments, foundations, isolated columns, and vast gaps filled by speculation. In Pompeii, those gaps are far narrower. The city stands like a cross-section of Roman life preserved with extraordinary clarity, so that one may look into a room and imagine its owner's status, into a shop and sense-eating habits, into a wall, and hear the language that once passed through its air. What makes Pompeii different is not simply that it survives, it is how it has been preserved. The answer lies within the very mechanism of its destruction. The eruption of AD 79 did not only destroy, it buried swiftly. Layers of volcanic material sealed the city, limiting prolonged exposure to air, light, rain, and the processes that would normally erase the traces of life. The speed of catastrophe, often synonymous with absolute violence, became instead the condition for an unintended preservation. Details of life, from architecture to paintings, from counters to objects, from the voids left by vanished organic matter to the arrangement of daily activity, were retained with rare immediacy. Pompeii is therefore not merely a past reconstructed through archaeological imagination. It is closer to a moment halted, closer to an image the ancient world captured in ash, heat, and silence across nearly 2,000 years. Through disaster, history was frozen. Through destruction, life was given form. If one could walk through Pompeii just an hour before everything changed, there might have been no sign large enough to force the city to stop breathing. Sunlight would still fall upon tiled roofs and pale walls. A merchant would still lean over his stall. Children would still run through familiar streets. Someone would still be setting bread at the doorway. Someone else calculating prices. Someone writing a few more words upon a wall, unaware that those letters would outlive the body that formed them. Voices would still echo across stone. Exchanges would continue. Footsteps would strike the city as they had through countless other mornings. The most terrifying aspect of the disaster, therefore, was not only death at the horizon, but the way it approached while everything still wore the shape of normal life, still warm, still close, still familiar enough that no one could feel the world standing at the edge of an irreversible fracture. The final hour of peace is always the hardest to recognize, because it is peaceful. And so Pompeii should not first be seen as a ruin, but as a city once filled with warmth, with its own rhythms, its own mornings, its own people not so different from any community that has lived, worked, eaten, loved, argued, left messages, built homes, opened shops, believing tomorrow would come. The lingering ache it leaves does not rest in broken stone, but in the truth that this was once a real place with real people, so close to life that standing among its remaining walls reveals not only archaeology, but the sudden absence of human presence. If one could enter an ancient city in its final peaceful hour, what would deserve to be seen first? A forum waking to life, a shop just opening, a wall still bearing someone's words, or simply sunlight resting upon stone before history closes beneath those streets, beneath markets, beneath walls and still bright paintings. The earth had already prepared another story, longer, hotter, deeper than any memory of humankind. Beneath the soil of Campania, deeper than the stone-paved streets, deeper than the sunlit gardens, deeper even than the memory of the generations who had lived at the mountain's foot, a silent process had been unfolding across centuries of geology, never once ceasing. In the lands around the Bay of Naples, where crops could rise green and abundant upon fertile slopes, that fertility was never an unconditional gift. It was the remnant of old fire, of old ash, of moments when the earth had opened and then sealed itself again. Vesuvius stood near Naples like a form long at rest, yet beneath that stillness lay a magma system with its own history, its own inertia, its own rhythm of accumulating energy, so slow that a human life could scarcely perceive it, so long that entire communities might mistake silence for the mountain's true nature. On the surface, vineyards continued to climb the slopes, Houses shone beneath the Mediterranean sun, markets opened, ships came and went, one rhythm of life following another. Beneath the surface, pressure continued to rise. On one side, the city. On the other, the deep time of heated stone. On one side, the habits of men. On the other, the patience of geology. The disaster of 79 AD, therefore, was not an event that fell without cause from the empty air, but the eruption point of a very long accumulation, a delayed consequence of forces that had been quietly at work long before any roof in Pompeii trembled. That silence had never truly been silence. Before the sky changed its colour, the ground had already spoken. Around the year 62 or 63 AD, Campania received a great shock, a fracture not only in stone walls but in the awareness of the communities who had long lived beneath the mountain's shadow. Pompeii and Herculaneum both suffered severe damage. Houses cracked open, roofs collapsed, interiors thrown into disarray. Public structures so deeply harmed that repair was no longer a choice, but a condition for urban life to continue. This was no minor tremor after which everything returned intact the following morning, but an event large enough to imprint itself upon collective memory, large enough for those who lived through it to write of it as a true disaster of the region. Modern estimates place the magnitude of this earthquake somewhere between 5.2 and 6.1, a retrospective figure that can never be exact to the last unit, yet sufficient to reveal the scale of destruction. In that moment, what was terrifying was not only the sound of breaking tiles or the tilting of walls, but a colder realization that the ground itself, the thing most trusted by human life, could betray it. A Roman city built upon the idea of order, of technique, of the endurance of stone, was forced to confront a truth older than all its constructions. The earth promised nothing. A city could endure war, could mend its walls, could recover from fire. But when the ground itself trembled, the belief in stability was no longer wounded at the surface, but at its root. What made the event of 62 or 63 AD unforgettable was not that it was the loud prelude to the eruption, but that it was the first time the inhabitants were compelled to feel directly that the danger did not come from beyond the city. It lay beneath their feet. And yet, Pompeii did not vanish after that upheaval. The city did not collapse and fall silent within the quake itself. It did what human beings so often do when faced with ruin. It repaired, rebuilt, reinforced, cleared away, returned to work, restored the rhythm of life piece by piece. From the earthquake of 62 or 63 AD until the years just before 79 AD, many parts of Pompeii entered a prolonged period of reconstruction, where new walls rose upon old foundations, where traces of earlier architecture remained beneath newer layers of repair, where new floors were laid over old ones, as if the city were writing a fresh skin upon its own fractured body. In districts such as Porta Stabia, archaeological evidence reveals substantial rebuilding, not a brief patching followed by closure, but a sustained condition of recovery. Here, something was braced. There, something was straightened. Some houses returned to use, some shops reopened. Some structures remained unfinished, as though the city had never been granted enough time to complete its own healing. In those years, Pompeii existed within a strange overlap between recovery and threat, between the will to normalize life and the fact that instability had never departed. Other tremors followed in the years after, complicating reconstruction. ensuring that the consequences of the first earthquake were never fully resolved. Thus, the path from calm to destruction in Pompeii was not a straight line. Between these 2 points stretched a long interval of repair, of adaptation, of endurance, of effort to make the abnormal appear normal, in patched walls, in half-restored floors, in those structures both old and new. Geological danger began to take on another form, no longer only a physical phenomenon, but a state of mind, familiar enough that people learned to live alongside it. From a scientific perspective, what unfolded beneath Vesuvius cannot be reduced to a simple formula, as though earthquakes must inevitably lead to eruption. The relationship is not so absolute. An active volcanic region may produce tremors through many mechanisms, just as a strong earthquake does not always foretell imminent destruction. Yet within an unstable magma system, repeated tremors, prolonged geological signals, subtle changes in the ground's baseline condition may indicate that equilibrium below is shifting. The eruption of 79 AD would later be identified as a Plinian eruption, a phenomenon marked by a towering eruption column and immense energy release, sufficient to transform the sky into a mechanism carrying ash, gas, heated material, and death across a wide expanse. Seen in this light, the years before 79 AD were not an empty pause before catastrophe, but a phase in which a geological system grew ever more strained, while human life clung to daily familiarity in order to preserve the sense of control. Tremors did not merely crack walls, they cracked the feeling of safety. When such vibrations persist long enough, people stand between 2 opposing responses, either heightened vigilance or a fatigue that turns the abnormal into something accepted as natural. Perhaps it is here that history becomes at once clear and difficult to grasp. The city remained, the city repaired, the city continued to build what had just fallen. The psychology of Pompeii in those years, if seen as a collective whole, likely traced a deeply human curve. First came shock, the shock that arrived when the ground shook and revealed that the familiar place of refuge could be damaged in a single morning. Then came labour, the labour that soothed fear through action, clearing rubble, reinforcing cracks, rebuilding roofs, reopening workshops, restoring goods to their stalls, using the rhythm of daily work to resist the sense of chaos. Finally came a quieter process still, the normalization of instability. The ground trembled again, walls cracked again, parts of the city remained unfinished, markets continued, houses were still inhabited, life refused to stop. This is what shaped Pompeii's deepest tragedy. Not complete ignorance, but a gradual familiarity with what ought to inspire fear. A community can endure abnormality for a short time through instinct for survival, but when that abnormality persists for years, it is absorbed into habit. At some point, the sound beneath the earth ceases to be a warning and becomes the background noise of life. The city had heard the earth speak, and yet continued to live as though time still lay ahead. The sentence is brief. It is enough. At this point, history opens into a space of quiet regret. If after the earthquake of 62 or 63 AD there had been a great evacuation from Pompeii, would the map of ancient memory be different? If the repeated tremors of the following years had been understood as the final signal of a dangerous system, rather than a nuisance of construction to be endured, would those streets have stood emptier on the fateful day? If the city had not continued to rebuild, had not patched its walls, had not restored its rhythm, would we today possess a Pompeii less complete in archaeology, yet less tragic in fate? No one can alter history. No conjecture can pull a community from the path it has already taken. What remains is a thin and chilling realization that tragedy does not always arrive through the absence of signs. But because people have learned to live with these signs for too long, the turning points existed. The city did not turn. Thus, the disaster of 79 AD had its beginning many years before the sky truly changed. Pompeii was not destroyed by a moment detached from cause, but by a prolonged sequence of geological tension and deeply human responses to it, from fear to repair, from adaptation to familiarity. In the end, what is most frightening may not be the final explosion, but the small movements that were absorbed into life for too long to be seen as warning. If a city can feel the ground change beneath its feet, what is more terrible, the moment when the sky breaks open, or the quiet signs that were overlooked long before, after years of tremors, repair, and waiting? The 24th day of August finally appeared upon the horizon of history. Midday on the 24th of August in the year 79 AD came to Pompeii like any other midday in a Roman city by the Bay of Naples, beneath Vesuvius, where light usually fell upon stone walls, tiled roofs, and paved streets with such consistency that people scarcely noticed it anymore. From within the city, the open space toward the mountain remained a familiar part of the horizon. Quiet, close, so close it seemed to have long been woven into daily life, as though a mountain could become a neighbour, a backdrop, something always present and therefore no longer questioned. And then, at that very hour when the sun should have sharpened every line, clarified every form, made everything more truthful, the light began to change in substance. It did not vanish. It became strange. The gentle gold gave way to a dim grey veil, as though the air had been disturbed from a depth beyond the sky. There was no sudden explosion tearing the city apart, no single impact that made all people abandon their tasks at once, but a more subtle, slower, harder to grasp sensation. The sky was no longer the sky of midday. From Vesuvius, a vast column of cloud began to rise, unlike any cloud the inhabitants had ever seen in seasons of rain or heat. It did not drift. It stood upright. It was not thin, nor dissolving, nor light with vapour, but dense, expanding from a central column driven upward by an invisible and immense force. On the ground, daily life had not yet collapsed, but it had been interrupted by a hesitation difficult to name. A few hands paused mid-motion, a few steps slowed, a few gazes lingered upward longer than usual. What interrupted the flow of Pompeii in that moment was not full understanding of the disaster, for no one yet understood what was unfolding, but the most ancient human instinct before nature. When the sky changes, life begins to waver with it. What rose above was not merely an unusual cloud, it was the eruption column of a Plinian eruption, one of the most violent expressions of a magma system when the pressure accumulated beneath the earth finally finds release. That column may have reached 20 to 30 kilometers into the atmosphere, a scale so vast that ordinary imagination can scarcely contain it. A house stands a few meters high, a city wall, somewhat more, a tree, a low hill, a watchtower, all shrink instantly before a column of matter thrust through layers of air, as though the earth itself were pulling a burning part of its body upward into the sky. ash, gas, pumice, fragments of rock, heat, energy compressed across time, all combined in a vertical motion that transformed the sky from a passive backdrop into the first stage upon which destruction declared itself. Across the Bay of Naples at Misenum, nearly 30 kilometers away, that cloud was still visible. This alone speaks to the scale of the event. It had already exceeded the bounds of a single city at the mountain's base and become a phenomenon spanning the entire bay. Pompeii no longer stood beneath a private sky. The whole region of Naples witnessed a signal too vast for ordinary experience to explain. In those early hours, astonishment may have been stronger than panic, for panic often requires a clear object, while here what appeared was both tangible and beyond full naming. A cloud of unfamiliar form demanding to be remembered. A familiar mountain turned into a mouth of eruption. A midday that remained midday, yet whose light no longer told the truth. From that moment, the sky ceased to serve as a backdrop for life below. It became the first witness to a collapse that had begun. From that immense column, the first materials began to fall upon Pompeii, sparse at first, scattered in the beginning, yet soon becoming continuous, distinct, growing heavier. The opening Plinian phase lasted some 18 to 20 hours, driving pumice and ash south and southeast, directly toward Pompeii beneath the main axis of dispersal. In scientific terms, this was fallout, material thrown high into the air before returning under gravity and wind. In the experience of a city at midday, it was the moment when disaster from above first touched the substance of life. Fine ash appeared as a dust not belonging to the streets, not to the kilns, not to any ordinary craft. After it came pumice, light and porous when held alone, yet under constant fall and in great number forming a tangible weight, audible, visible, accumulating. Their sound may have been among the most haunting elements of that noon. Not a single distant roar of the volcano, but the steady tapping of stones striking tiles, courtyards, thresholds, roads, like a strange rain in which each drop marked a world slipping out of place. A human being may endure an unusual sight for a few minutes and still persuade himself that it will pass. One may gaze upon an unfamiliar cloud with wonder not yet turned to fear. But when the sky begins to cast matter upon the city, when disaster gains sound, surface, weight, then nature is no longer outside life. It has entered the courtyard, the roof, the street. Vision diminished, air thickened, light weakened layer by layer. And yet, in those early hours, the inhabitants of Pompeii did not all flee at once. A city does not abandon itself at the first moments of what no one fully understands. That hesitation was profoundly human. That hesitation was also profoundly fateful. What deepened the opening of this disaster beyond physical fear was not only the falling material, but the way it altered the very sense of space. As the column fed more ash into the atmosphere, as the layer of fallout thickened, daylight did not vanish like a lamp extinguished. Its nature was bent. It became dim, opaque, without direction. This is among the most powerful psychological pressures a human can experience, for sight does not merely reveal objects, it provides distance, orientation, safety, escape, the rhythm of the surrounding world. When light remains yet can no longer be trusted, the mind begins to lose its most familiar tool for reading the environment. A street remains where it was, yet appears different. A roof still stands, yet feels heavier, nearer, stranger. The landmarks that once sustained order in Pompeii begin to drift from their familiarity simply because light itself has changed. At Misenum, across the bay, the growing cloud and darkness were already enough to disturb observers at a distance. At Pompeii, directly beneath the path of ash and pumice, the loss of orientation must have been far greater. Midday still existed by the sun's measure, yet no longer belonged to the kind of daylight humans could trust. It was a transformation slow, subtle, relentless. Not night arriving at once, not death arriving at once. Only everything shifting from its normal shape. Only the light of day gradually taking on the colour of a prolonged dying. Only the city, in that moment, beginning to understand that what was unfolding was not a rare spectacle that would soon fade, but the beginning of a process in which every passing minute reduced the human ability to understand where they stood. It is here that the disaster truly began, not when all ended, but when daylight lost the nature of day. From this point, history opens a question both small and profound. Small as a shift of wind, deep as the fate of a city. What might have happened had Pompeii not stood within the main path of the fallout in those first hours? What if the ash column had been carried elsewhere around the Bay of Naples? What if those roofs had received only a thin veil of dust instead of continuous pumice fall? If those streets had merely greyed with ash instead of growing heavy with stone? If that noon had been a day of terror but not yet the threshold of destiny? Geological reconstructions and dispersal models suggest that wind direction was decisive in determining which regions suffered heavier pumice fall. Pompeii suffered not only because of proximity to Vesuvius, but because at that moment it lay precisely where ash and stone were driven most heavily. Tragedy does not always begin with distance, it begins with direction, not only with position on a map, but with where the wind chooses to carry the mountain's matter. Thus, on that midday of August 24th, 79 AD, Pompeii had not yet reached its final death, yet it had already crossed a boundary far more significant than its outward appearance suggested. The city understood, though not fully, that the sky above was no longer a normal shelter. What once gave light, direction, and the sense of order within a day now became the channel through which destruction spread. From that moment, disaster was no longer hidden beneath the ground or confined to the mountain. It had appeared, it had fallen, it had settled into the spaces of a life. It had altered the colour of noon. It had transformed the sky into something opposed to the very protection it once symbolised. When the sky can no longer be trusted, human beings do what they have always done before great catastrophe. They try to understand what's happening. They try to hold on to what can still be held. And then, at some point, they must run. On the afternoon of August 24th at 79, Pompeii was not erased from the earth in a single blow. It was stepping, one slow step at a time, into the dark province of fate, as slowly as a great door swinging shut, slow enough that people still had time to hope, still had time to doubt, still had time to persuade themselves that perhaps this was only a violent disturbance, and one that would soon pass. Pumice and volcanic ash had already begun to fall without pause in the opening phase of the eruption, and the fall went on for hours, not like an instant cut, but like a burden steadily increasing, first settling over roof tiles, over courtyards, over the stone-paved streets, and then settling over the consciousness of the whole city, inside the houses, once accustomed to the rhythm of meals, of footsteps across the atrium, of light descending from the small patch of sky above the inner court. The air had changed, the light had worsened, the sounds from outside had grown strange. Each time someone opened the door to look out, they no longer saw an ordinary Campanian afternoon, but a sky that seemed to be corrupting itself into a lower vault, a heavier vault, a dirtier vault. There were no warning sirens, no signs pointing the way to evacuation, no single commanding voice from above telling them where to go, what to do, when to run. Each household had only its own eyes, its own ears, its own intuition, the words of its neighbours, the movement of its own street. And so the first reaction was not a single mass flight, but hundreds of separate hesitations, quiet, private, and deeply human. Some households barred their doors as though wood, bolts, brick walls, and tiled roofs might turn the house into a safe shell while heaven and earth were being deformed outside. Some began gathering the small things that mattered, a few coins, a piece of jewellery, a cloth bag, keepsake, things light enough to carry yet heavy enough in meaning that they could not bear to leave them behind. Some did not leave at once, because the signs before their eyes, though frightening, could still be read as something extreme but temporary, a monstrous rain that would eventually stop, a rage in the natural world that would in time subside. Some kept opening the door again and again because they were still waiting for someone who had not returned. A child still somewhere in the street, a husband, a mother, a servant gone to market since morning. In those houses, disaster first appeared not as fire or death, but as a question with no clear answer. Stay or go. Hold fast to the house or gamble on the road, carry the wealth or carry the time, wait for one more person or save those already present. Every decision was reasonable in the instant it was made. Every decision could be wrong. That was the first tragedy. And as each family began to respond in its own way, the city also ceased to be a single body, and slowly broke apart into countless small directions of movement, and from those movements the crowd began to be born as a new living organism of the catastrophe. Out in the streets, where the current of daily life had once passed in the footsteps of merchants, servants, craftsmen, families, children, and the old, the change grew clearer by the minute. Ash fell thicker. Pumice clicked and rattled down upon awnings, upon the backs of animals, upon the paving stones. People called to one another across courtyards, through windows, through half-open doorways. Some dragged pack animals behind them. Some snatched up children in haste. Some walked while constantly turning back toward their roofs, as though to look away only once was to feel the past cut off forever. Some looked up at the gigantic column swelling above Vesuvius, and then immediately fled, as though instinct had decided before reason could speak. Others still lingered at the meeting of streets, not because they were unafraid, but because they did not yet know what place could truly be safer than the one where they stood. In many homes, belongings were left unfinished in chests, in cupboards, in corners, in the arrested posture of a life cut off midway, as though human hands had tried to gather their world back into themselves and failed for lack of time. The household objects that remained were not merely signs of abandonment, they were signs of an attempt that did not succeed. People had tried to take more with them, They could not. The crowd in the street did not possess a single will. That is what made it both fragile and frightening. A crowd like that does not move like an army, does not think like one mind, does not see the same thing at the same moment. In the same street, one person had already resolved to leave the city, another had only just begun to consider it, another was still turning back into the house one last time, another could not move quickly because of age, because of children, because of too many belongings, because of anxiety over a loved one not yet found. And so the disaster did not break over Pompeii like a common signal, driving the whole city through the gates in a single instant. It spread like a crack through glass. From this point to that, from one family to another, from the fear of one person to the movement of 10, the city was no longer merely looking up to watch the sky. It was beginning to shatter into innumerable small decisions, decisions as small as a door locked shut, as small as a purse tucked into a garment, as small as the turn of a head to wait for one more soul. Seen from afar, it was a crowd. From within, it was thousands of fates choosing for themselves the most imperfect of imperfect roads. Across the Bay of Naples, at Misenum, nearly 30 kilometers from Vesuvius, fear appeared in another form. There, the streets of Pompeii were not yet thickening under pumice. No roofs were yet visibly bowing under their load. But there was a strange cloud column rising over the horizon like a giant tree growing upside down from the depths of the earth. A young man watched it, remembered it, survived it, and years later set it down in 2 letters to a historian. Because of him, that night remained not only in ash, but in words as well. At Misenum too, his uncle, commander of the fleet, was at first drawn by the extraordinary nature of the phenomenon and wanted to approach more closely, to see with his own eyes what was happening. Then a plea for help from a woman living in a place that could be reached only by sea altered the course of that decision entirely. Curiosity gave way to duty. Observation gave way to rescue. The voyage out was no longer a movement toward a strange spectacle, but a movement into a region where nature was beginning to close the ways by which human beings lived. The death of that commander would later become one of the most painful marks of the whole catastrophe, because it reminds us that there was a very brief hour when the calamity could still be understood as something one might approach, might relieve, might overcome. That hour passed very quickly. What was recorded at Misenum shows that even in a place lying across a bay from the mountain, people were already struggling with darkness, tremors, rumour, and the chaos of perception. When the ground began to shake, when the light collapsed, when information came in fragments and contradictions, it became terribly difficult to distinguish lucid calm from panic spreading from one person to the next. And for that reason, the fear of Pompeii was not a product of later imagination. It was anchored in a survivor's account, in a real night, in observations carried through time. Misenum, from the distance of a bay, had already begun to understand that this was no longer an ordinary natural event. Pompeii, lying beneath the shadow of the mountain itself, could only feel each passing hour make every choice harder. Looking at what archaeology has left behind, the response of the inhabitants appears in all its unevenness. Some houses seem to have been shut up like little fortresses, because the first human reflex is often to turn the home into a refuge. Some victims were found with coins, with jewellery, with small valuable things easy enough to carry in the hand, as though in the instant of leaving the familiar world, people still tried to take with them some fragment of its worth. There are signs that larger possessions, heavier possessions, more cumbersome possessions were left behind halfway, not because they were not precious, but because time was too short, strength was too little, circumstances did not permit it. Some families must have been separated when the disaster began, making the search for loved ones almost impossible not to undertake, to look for a child, for parents, for a spouse, for someone who had stepped out in the morning. Such acts did not make people weaker. They made them more truly human, even when that very thing cost them more time. Some chose to remain indoors because they believed thick walls were safer than the open streets. Some chose the city gates, the main roads, the route toward the shoreline if such a route still remained. There is even evidence that sheltering in small rooms was once chosen as a strategy of survival. Yet the disaster did not reward every choice according to its original logic. A shelter could become a trap. A road of escape could become a place laid bare beneath the collapsing sky. This leads to a deeper truth, one that belongs to the way the human mind answers danger. When the first abnormal signs appear, the first reflex is not always to run. Human beings often need time to verify what they are seeing, to look toward the person beside them, to ask a neighbour, to reassure themselves that perhaps things are not yet at their worst. A mind trained by ordinary order tends to cling a little longer to the ordinary, even while the world around it is falling away layer by layer. That first afternoon, there were likely some who thought this was only a terrible rain of pumice, and that would eventually stop. There were likely some who only truly decided to leave when they saw others beginning to move. Because in crisis, a crowd is not merely a crowd, it is also a living source of information. When some began to run, fear became more visible. When some still remained standing, hesitation too was granted a little more legitimacy. And so what was terrifying did not lie only in the mountain that was erupting. It also lay in the fact that the useful time for response was shrinking with every hour, while human perception did not change course in the first instant. Nature was accelerating. The human mind was slower. In that distance between the two lay tragedy. Only change one small variable, and the sorrow of Pompeii becomes clearer still. If most of the inhabitants began to leave only after ash and pumice had already thickened to the point where roofs were bearing a dangerous added load, then the roads of escape must already have narrowed beneath the weight of falling debris, beneath failing visibility, beneath the exhaustion of bodies forced to move through an endless rain of stone. If many families waited too long to gather possessions, to wait for one person still missing, to believe that shutting the door would keep them safe for only a few more hours, then that seemingly reasonable decision may have been the final one. If the cries for help, the rumours, the signs in the sky, or the signals carried by the movement of the crowd came only a little later, then the city may have lost even the scattered chance to respond that it still possessed that afternoon. In catastrophe. The boundary between life and death sometimes lies neither in courage, nor in strength, nor in intelligence, but in a very small interval of time, a few hours, a few minutes, even a decision made too late. The most important moment of that afternoon was not when Vesuvius began to erupt, but when Pompeii ceased to be a community sharing one vague anxiety and became a labyrinth of scattered reactions. From the outside, it was still a Roman city beneath a darkening sky. From within, it had already split into thousands of private choices, each one fragile, each one burdened with a small human hope placed against a force infinitely greater than those who faced it. Anxiety was no longer merely a feeling. It had become action. Panic had not yet burst into absolute chaos, but it had taken shape in hurried footsteps, in doors closing, in backward glances, in the objects thrust into human hands at the last moment. And as the hours passed, what fell from the sky was no longer merely a sign. It became a real weight, slowly covering the whole city. From about midday, drifting gradually toward afternoon on August 24th, 79, Pompeii began to move into an orbit unlike any it had ever known before. Not the orbit of the sun, nor the orbit of Roman urban life, but the orbit of a colossal eruptive column hurling volcanic material high into the air and then letting the sky itself cast it back down upon the earth. In modern stratigraphic reconstructions, this phase of sustained column eruption and pumice fall lasted for many hours, often described as roughly 18 to 20, long enough for the afternoon to pass, for night to descend, for morning to come again, and still fail to restore the familiar light. The dispersal of eruptive material placed Pompeii directly within the zone of very heavy fallout, while Herculaneum in the first stage did not receive such a deep covering of pumice, as though both stood beneath the same mountain, yet their fates were bent apart by the wind, by the axis of dispersal, by a few variables that seemed small and yet were sufficient to alter the historical shape of an entire city. From the paved streets to the inner courts, from roof tiles to narrow alleys, from the ways between painted walls to the spaces between columns, every surface began receiving the falling material in a steady rhythm, cold, dry, and relentless. And so the darkness did not come only from the approach of evening. It came from the very thing that was slowly blotting out the sky. At first, the white pumice fell, thickening steadily, ceaselessly, producing over roofs, over stone courts, over roadways, a monotonous sound that grew larger with time, a sound that did not overwhelm in one violent instant, but prevailed through duration. Then, in the classic stratigraphic sequence of that year's eruption, the white layer gradually yielded to grey pumice, darker, denser, heavier, continuing to pour over the city like a rain that had abandoned any thought of ending. That accumulation was no longer merely a visual impression. It was real load. It was actual weight. In many parts of Pompeii, the material falling during the opening phase may have reached some 3 meters in depth, enough to turn roofs into planes carrying a burden far beyond anything daily life had ever required them to bear. Those who had not escaped the city in the early hours may have become trapped within houses, in small rooms, in temporary refuges, buried beneath pumice and lapilli, or killed when roofs and walls collapsed under the mounting weight. At this point, the buildings themselves became almost silent characters in the catastrophe, for they too were being driven toward the limit of their own physical endurance. A tiled roof was no longer merely a roof. It had become a thin skin between human beings and a mass increasing minute by minute. A wall was no longer a support. It had become an object that might crack, might lean, might fall. Some recent studies even suggest that concurrent seismic tremors during the eruption likely contributed further to collapses and deaths, making this disaster not only a story of material descending from above, but also of the ground beneath refusing to remain still, and at some point, without any new explosion, without any fresh warning, the whole city began to understand one slow but absolute truth, that the sky was not merely threatening it, the sky was pressing down upon it. That weight, of course, didn't bear only upon the roofs. It bore upon the eyes, the throat, the chest, upon the body's very ability to keep operating in its usual rhythm. Fine volcanic ash, as modern understanding makes clear, can irritate the eyes and upper airways after only short exposure, can worsen pre-existing conditions such as asthma, can cause coughing, tightness in the chest, and distress even in those who had previously been entirely healthy, because such tiny particles do not fall like stones one can easily avoid, but hang in the air, slip inward, cling to the membranes, and make breathing itself into a task that requires effort to complete. At the same time, pumice and ash piled upon roofs, upon beams, upon every horizontal surface, so that in many of the first hours the greatest danger lay not in heat, but in mass. A roof may endure rain, endure sunlight, endure time, but it was not made to bear a storm of volcanic stone lasting hour upon hour while the load continuously increased. What seemed most durable in ordinary urban life turned out to be fragile before one of nature's simplest forms of arithmetic, layer by layer, layer by layer, layer by layer, until their total surpassed the limit of what the material could endure. In such a setting, darkness too ceased to be merely a matter of sight. As the light diminished, the impacts grew louder, the air thickened, and the familiar signals by which people measured time and direction began to warp. Afternoon was no longer clearly afternoon. Night was no longer clearly night. Distance was no longer clearly near or far. Ancient descriptions of a dense darkness, of a condition in which it became difficult to know what was safe, meet here with the modern scientific understanding of prolonged ashfall, where the senses do not fail in a single shock, but through a long sequence of diminishment, harder to see, harder to breathe, harder to walk, even harder to wait. This is nature at its least noisy and most cruel, not killing with one blow, but by taking away, one by one, the little capacities a human being still needs in order to remain alive. Inside Pompeii during those hours, choices began to vanish sooner than people realized. Remaining indoors at first seemed reasonable, because walls still shielded one from the direct fall of material, because a closed door still gave the feeling of order, because four walls always suggest that human beings have managed to divide the world into an outer realm of chaos and an inner realm of safety. Yet as the pumice deepened, the place of shelter itself began to betray the trust placed in it. Roofs grew heavier, columns bore more strain. The sound of falling material overhead passed from steady to menacing, from menacing to a physical warning. Nor did going outside open any clear road of deliverance. Streets sank deeper beneath the material. Footsteps lost their firmness. Direction blurred in the light broken by ash. Breathing became harder in air full of fine particles, and every decision had to be made amid too little information, too little visibility, too little time. Some archaeological finds show victims discovered in small rooms, confirming that the strategy of staying inside was indeed chosen, not out of foolishness, but because at a certain stage it genuinely seemed the least terrible option. The face of the catastrophe here was not that of a blazing spectacle before the eyes, but of something filling, pressing, sealing, extinguishing, little by little. In many cases, death came not from visible flame, but from invisible accumulation becoming too heavy, too prolonged, too much, slow, yet merciless. From this point, history opens onto a sorrowful possibility so grave it scarcely needs embellishment. What if Pompeii had been brought to its end entirely by that white-grey rain alone, before the hotter, swifter surges ever arrived? What if enough people believed that being indoors was safer, while in truth the roof above them was the first thing to betray them? What if that Plinian phase had lasted a few hours longer, or if the fallout axis had shifted even more heavily over Pompeii, so that those who survived the night in the first place would no longer have existed in sufficient number to witness what was coming next? These questions do not rise from pure imagination. They stand upon a reality archaeology has confirmed, that even in the opening phase people were already dying from burial beneath pumice and lapilli, or from the collapse of the structures around them. In other words, this city came very near to the possibility of being ended solely by the prolonged descent of material from the sky. The pyroclastic currents later completed the work, but the shadow of total destruction had appeared long before that, at the moment when the first roof began to bow, when the first room was no longer strong enough to protect those inside, when a rain that seemed at first to be only rain became instead a mechanism of burial. In a universe where fate sometimes turns on the wind and the density of falling matter, survival may at times depend neither on courage nor wisdom, but on how much longer a single roof can hold, no more than that. By the end of this phase, Pompeii had entered a state of confinement, not by city gates, not by soldiers, but by geology. The streets grew harder to cross with every hour. The roofs grew more dangerous with every hour. The air grew less breathable with every hour. Even the light could no longer be trusted with every hour. The sense of time itself was warped beneath a volcanic rain that seemed unwilling to end, transforming an ordinary day in the Roman world into a long, heavy night with no stars, no true sunset. Only a sky continuing to give back to the city what it had held above its head for so many hours. The stratigraphic descriptions of the Plinian phase, together with the traces of victims from the early stage, all suggest a process of accumulation, less dramatic in the sense of singular explosive moments, yet unspeakably cruel in the whole of it. By now, Pompeii had scarcely any good escape left. Nature had gained absolute advantage through a rhythm that was slow, repetitive, heavy, and steady, and from that very column still raining material down, another form of destruction was beginning to take shape as the stability of the column failed and its collapse generated surges of hot, fast-moving matter with immediate killing force. But what was falling from the sky was still not the last thing Pompeii would have to endure. After long hours of pumice and ash pouring down from the towering eruption column, Pompeii entered a span of time heavy as lead, when everything had gone too far to still be called waiting, yet had not reached its end. From August 24th AD 79, by the familiar reckoning of tradition, the Plinian phase endured long enough for the sky to change its colour, for light to be ground into a dim opacity no longer strong enough to separate day from night, for streets, courtyards, corridors, open doorways, thresholds, the very axes of movement shaped for human passage, to slowly become shallow channels awaiting another kind of motion. Those who remained in the city must have been exhausted, lungs scorched by fine dust, eyes burning with ash, direction dissolved beneath the steady fall of pumice and the sound of materials striking roofs already pushed beyond their limit. What was most terrifying at that moment was not yet the weight from above, but the realization that temporary shelters, darkened rooms, covered porticos, corners that still seemed to offer some protection, were beginning to lose their meaning before a danger that did not fall from the sky, but rushed horizontally through space, carrying heat, ash, fragments of stone, and a force of motion capable of turning the urban structure itself into the very path through which it would pass. From here, Pompeii was no longer merely a city slowly buried. It became a city struck down by something that came too quickly for the human body to recognize that the rules of catastrophe had changed. After the phase of falling pumice and ash, the pyroclastic currents truly reached Pompeii, not as a marginal detail of the eruption, but as the core of the destruction that followed, the element that collapsed nearly all remaining chances of survival. Modern reconstructions describe not a single surge but multiple PDC events appearing before, during, and after the final stages of the eruption column, with the stronger later surges sweeping across the city with decisive force. The image to retain here is not a visible sea of flame, but a dense and stratified mass, both heavy and diffuse, pressed close to the ground, where hot gases, ash, pumice, and rock fragments moved like a torn cross-section of the mountain itself collapsing outward. In houses with doors still open, at thresholds where someone may have just stepped out to look toward Vesuvius, along streets where a few might still have tried to pull one another away. The disaster shifted phase without leaving time for any reassessment. The city passed from being covered to being swept through. There was no second plan, no better refuge, no margin left to correct a decision made only moments before. There must have been a moment, perhaps arriving more in silence than in sound, when Pompeii ceased to be a city resisting nature and became a space where survival had already ended. To understand that moment clearly, one must look directly at the true nature of the advancing current, for to call it smoke would be too light, too vague, too far from the physical reality of the death it carried. A pyroclastic density current is not smoke in any ordinary sense, not a drifting veil that passes and fades, but a chaotic mixture of heated particles and gases, of fine ash, shattered stone, pumice, and mechanical energy, sliding rapidly down slopes and across low terrain like flowing water, yet heavier than water, hotter than fire in the experience of living bodies, and harder to escape than any wind because it claims the very ground on which human beings must stand to run. Technical descriptions regard it as one of the most lethal volcanic hazards for two simple but absolute reasons: speed and heat. Such currents may move faster than 80 kilometers per hour, swift enough to render human reflexes meaninglessly slow. Their temperatures commonly reach several hundred degrees Celsius, and even the range of 200 to 300 degrees, not the extreme of many PDCs, is already sufficient to cause death both indoors and outdoors. Evidence from modern eruptions shows that at such temperatures, people perish whether they stand beneath open sky or seek shelter within structures, because the very design of living spaces, with doors, corridors, courtyards, and openings, allows heat to penetrate rapidly inside. At Pompeii, studies of the interaction between PDCs and the urban fabric indicate that the initial flows entering the city's edge may have deposited heat in the range of roughly 300 to 360 degrees Celsius, even though temperatures in certain enclosed spaces could be locally reduced as buildings altered the lower part of the current. This detail renders the picture colder still, not because it lessens the danger, but because it reveals that even where the flow was weakened, the remaining heat still exceeded the limits of the human body. Shelter that made sense under falling ash became a sealed trap. A door that once promised safety became only a narrow conduit for heat. A street that once offered escape became a channel guiding death forward. The reason human beings could scarcely escape such a phenomenon lies in the way every ordinary survival strategy collapsed at once. The speed of the current exceeded the capacity for judgment under normal conditions, let alone in a city already darkened. Suffocating, filled with pumice and the sounds of collapse after hours of crisis. Its temperature was too great for the brief interval between recognition and reaction to save anyone. The urban environment, instead of protecting, became a framework of transmission. Open doors, corridors, courtyards, thresholds, the spaces between walls, all that once defined the order and comfort of a Roman city, became geometries that guided the current deeper inside. Research at Pompeii shows that the structure of buildings influenced the direction, heat deposition, and patterns of damage, meaning the city did not merely receive the PDC but interacted with it, deflecting it in some places, concentrating it in others, cooling parts of its lower layer locally while allowing its upper and more diffuse portions to pass over obstacles and continue onward. Thus, a person inside a house was not necessarily safer than one in the street, one pressed against a wall no better than one running, a decision to remain no wiser than a decision to flee. This was no longer a matter of will, of composure, of choosing at the right moment. It was a matter of the biological limits of the human body when confronted with a phenomenon both hotter than life can endure and faster than the reflexes the body can complete. The disaster became absolute not because anyone surrendered, but because in that moment nature operated on a scale beyond every strategy learned in ordinary life. And yet, even in events that seem most final, history always leaves a narrow space for reflection, where a single altered physical variable might have reshaped the memory that followed. If the direction of the wind and the propagation of the PDCs had shifted slightly, so that the main flows did not sweep directly across Pompeii, the city might still have been heavily buried beneath pumice and ash, still deeply wounded, yet perhaps not marked by the immediacy of finality that defines it in modern memory. If a few collapses of the eruption column had dispersed differently under the influence of terrain, if the strongest surges had missed the urban axis by a small margin, some inhabitants might have survived until the next morning. The scale of death in the final phase might have differed. The destruction of Pompeii might have been told as a slower, more scattered, less absolute catastrophe. Such possibilities do not contradict history. For studies of Vesuvius emphasize that the actual impact of PDCs depends on direction, terrain, the characteristics of each flow, and the way the city interacts with them. Distance from the volcano is only one part of fate. The rest lies in the physics of motion, in the geometry of space, in small deviations that, at volcanic scale, are enough to alter the destiny of an entire city. In that sense, Pompeii did not perish simply because it stood near Vesuvius. It perished because many conditions closed together in a single, relentless sequence. The death of Pompeii, therefore, did not arrive as a single explosion, not as a clean stroke of fate, but as a sequence of mechanisms growing ever more absolute, the sky changing colour, pumice falling, darkness thickening, roofs bearing their final load, panic stretching into exhaustion, and at last the pyroclastic current sweeping through what space remained. After all that had accumulated, the city was no longer in a state of resistance. It had crossed the boundary where life could still bargain with nature. When the heat passed, when the ash settled, what remained was not merely a buried city, but traces of human beings held within the volcanic material, as though time itself, instead of continuing forward, had solidified around their bodies at the final moment. When the last heat withdrew from Pompeii in AD 79, when ash, pumice, and eruptive materials had settled upon the streets, thresholds, small courtyards, and rooms that once held human breath, the city collapsed no further, fled no further, uttered no sound. It fell into stillness. That silence was not the calm of a late afternoon along the Bay of Naples, but the silence of a place where movement has been cut off mid-course, where an arm had not yet lowered, a step not yet completed, a body not yet beyond its doorway had been locked within material that was slowly cooling. Across Pompeii, in narrow streets, in enclosed rooms, along thresholds, beside walls, beneath fallen roofs, human bodies were enclosed by ash compressing hour by hour, day by day, year by year. Time continued forward, yet for them it was no longer a flow. It became a layer that thickened, hardened, sealed, and in the generations that followed, as the soft parts of the body vanished within the hardened ash, their final presence did not disappear entirely. It withdrew from organic matter and left behind a void, a hollow bearing the exact form of the final moment, as though death here did not dissolve into nothingness, but became a negative imprint of the human form within the earth. Within those invisible cavities, centuries later, archaeology found one of the most direct ways humanity has ever touched the past. In the 19th century, as excavation at Pompeii began to move away from treasure hunting toward a more ordered practice, Giuseppe Fiorelli emerged as a figure who transformed not only the fate of the site, but the way archaeology itself would read ruins. He did not enter Pompeii seeking miracles. He entered knowing that earth and stone preserve data, that volcanic ash does not merely conceal but remembers, that within layers of silent material there may remain the geometry of a human life. From 1863 onward, through the method he refined, more than 100 casts were created, not by reviving the dead, not by any mystery, but by an act both simple and profound in its consequences, identifying unusual cavities within the compacted ash, pouring liquid material into them, allowing it to harden, then removing the outer shell so that the human form emerged from the very space once occupied by a body. That moment must have carried a different weight. For before the archaeologists were no longer just floors, walls, or fragments. Before them stood a human posture. A death that had occurred nearly 2,000 years earlier now appeared with knees drawn up, with hands raised to the face, with a chest collapsing into the hollow where panic had once halted. Fiorelli's work did not end with that initial discovery. Later generations preserved, studied, and displayed these casts, reading within them not only surface form but the bones that sometimes remained, so that each cast became not merely an object to be seen, but a continuing record still capable of speaking about the person who died. Yet the power of these casts becomes fully clear only when one fundamental truth is kept precise: they are not intact bodies carried across 2 millennia. What remains is not the biological body in its original state, but the archaeological form of the body at its final moment, after victims were buried within volcanic material that quickly sealed the space around them. Soft tissues decomposed, while the hardened ash preserved the cavity marked by that form. Liquid plaster filled that cavity, hardened, and allowed the lost figure to appear once more. Within many casts, skeletal elements remain, a silent layer of evidence between physical reality and reconstructed shape. This is what makes Pompeii singular in the history of archaeology. In many places, the past is inferred from brick, inscription, foundation, or surviving objects. Here, the past nearly takes form through human posture itself. A body fallen beside a path is no longer an abstraction. It is evidence that at that moment someone tried to take one more step and could not. A figure curled upon itself does not merely indicate death, it shows how that death approached the body. Thus, when the modern world looks upon the casts of Pompeii, what appears is not only information, what appears is a presence interrupted. Scientifically, the mechanism is both harsh and clear. Rapid burial by volcanic material created a natural mold around the body. Over time, organic components decayed, leaving a cavity within the compacted ash. When a liquid such as plaster fills that cavity and hardens, it forms a three-dimensional model of the original shape. The haunting power lies in the fact that this model does not merely record a human outline, but preserves the posture of the final movement. Not just a figure, but an action cut short, a reflex locked in place, a moment when muscles contracted in pain, in heat, in toxic gases, before something too vast for a finite body to resist. Genetic research published in 2024 notes that around 104 casts have been made from roughly 1,000 victims identified at Pompeii, an important detail that keeps the narrative in proper scale. The casts are a unique and precious data set, but they do not represent all who died in the city. The more precise this understanding becomes, the greater their weight. For science, in this case, does not diminish emotion. It sharpens it, brings it closer, makes it harder to deny. It tells us that here, at this exact point in ash, in this exact posture, a final moment has been preserved. Perhaps that is why simply imagining oneself standing in a 19th century excavation pit before an anonymous cavity newly discovered beneath compacted ash already feels different. At first there is only suspicion, then liquid plaster flows into what the eye cannot see, then waiting, then the moment when the outer layer of ash is slowly removed, fragment by fragment, so slowly that one scarcely dares to breathe, until a knee appears, an arm appears, the shape of a human body emerges, as though not matter were being uncovered but memory were pushing itself up from the earth. If history were read only through texts, Pompeii would already stand as a rare preservation of a Roman city, an immense archive of architecture, wall painting, daily life, and urban order. But with the casts, it becomes something else. It does not only show how people once lived here, it shows how they died. Not in a grotesque sense, but in a closeness that is almost unbearable. The past does not always return through words, through names, or through intact narratives. It returns as a silent form, as the contraction of a body, as the trace of a deeply human reflex before a force beyond reach. In that, the casts of Pompeii move beyond the status of simple archaeological artifacts. They become memory given shape, memory that does not speak yet compels the present to pause before it. Pompeii haunts the modern world not only because its streets still bear the marks of wheels, not only because its walls retain their colour, not only because its shops, courtyards, and gardens can still be recognised after nearly 2,000 years, but because within that entire architecture remain the traces of human beings held in the final posture of their lives. Through the casting technique, the past here is no longer inferred solely from objects. It nearly stands before the eye. A city once destroyed by a volcano now appears not merely as a buried settlement, but as a place where time has solidified around human fate, around the helplessness of the body, around the absolute fragility of civilization before the deep movements of the earth. Walls show what they built, streets show where they walked, the casts show where they stopped. That is the difference. That is why the image of Pompeii has never been only one of ruins. It is the image of presence remaining after destruction. And from that very place arises the deepest paradox after every form was locked within ash. Pompeii did not at once enter the memory of the world. It sank quietly, almost nameless, for centuries, as though the city first had to vanish completely before it could be seen again. In the immediate aftermath of the eruption of AD 79 at the foot of Vesuvius, Pompeii did not vanish beyond human reach in any absolute sense. Urban life had been severed. The rhythm of markets, of footsteps, of meals, of trade had fallen silent, yet the place itself remained, a broken landscape, buried, muted, but not entirely erased. In those first days, then the first months, perhaps even through the first year after the catastrophe, there may still have been brief returns by survivors, by kin, by those who sought a face, a room, a storeroom, a familiar street once so well known that it could be walked with closed eyes. But now, upon returning, what stood before them was no longer the city they had known, but a space half remaining, half lost, half risen, half submerged, where ash still held heat. The ground had shifted, and every familiar marker seemed displaced, as though the very order of space that once upheld memory had been turned aside by an immense and unseen hand. From that moment, Pompeii entered a second life, no longer a living city beneath the skies of Campania, but a place not yet named as ruin, a presence defined by its own absence, lingering in local memory yet more as a heavy void than a place spoken of with certainty. The city had not wholly dissolved. It had simply ceased to live as it once had. Within that second life, the earliest acts of recovery and excavation began to leave a new layer of human intervention upon the older layer of destruction. Recent archaeological studies suggest that after the eruption, there were efforts of salvage, retrieval, the reclaiming of possessions, tunnels driven through volcanic deposits, and even signs that such activities did not end with the immediate aftermath but may have continued long thereafter. Certain tunnels, certain objects dated beyond AD 79, certain disturbances within excavation contexts all indicate that Pompeii was not a moment sealed shut and left untouched for nearly 17 centuries. There were hands that reached it after its death. There were footsteps that crossed its buried surface for many different purposes. Some returned in grief, seeking loved ones, clinging to the faint hope that something might still be saved. Others dug for wealth, for metal, for small objects of value that might sustain life in a world after disaster. In such a context, acts of retrieval cannot always be read through a simple moral lens. They were not merely plunder, they could be survival, mourning, an attempt to recover fragments of a life erased by ash. Some areas were cut through to gain access to what lay beneath. Some objects were removed or displaced. Some of the original bonds between house, object, person, and place began to loosen, to break, to shift. The most unsettling realization lies not in the image of ruin, but in something far subtler, that Pompeii, even in death, continued to be touched, reread, rearranged according to needs wholly different from the archaeology of centuries to come. To understand this city, one must ask not only how it was buried, but how it was handled after burial. At this point, science and archaeology become indispensable, for a site can only be understood when we perceive not only the moment of its destruction, but also the quiet transformations that follow. When an area is disturbed by post-disaster activity, the original relationships between people, structures, objects, and position can no longer remain entirely intact. This means that not everything found in Pompeii still lies exactly where it stood on the day of AD 79 when ash and pumice fell. An object may have been drawn away from where it once belonged. A void within the buried layers may owe its existence not only to geological processes, but also to human excavation. A room may have been entered long before modern archaeologists first saw it. This reality does not diminish Pompeii. It renders it more real. It draws the city away from the illusion of a perfectly preserved image and returns it to true history, where even the death of a city does not conclude in a single instant, but extends into a long, silent aftermath marked by human presence. From this, the forgetting of Pompeii must also be properly understood. It was not merely the loss of a point on a map. It was the loss of a continuous narrative within human awareness. The city remained beneath the earth, yet it ceased to be a living name, no longer a reality regularly invoked in shared memory, no longer a place into which surrounding societies could step, read, understand, and weave into their own sense of time. When a place persists in matter but dissolves in language, memory, and naming, time begins to complete its work. From those early interventions after the disaster until the systematic excavations of the 18th century, Pompeii entered a silence so prolonged that, measured against the brevity of human life, it borders on the infinite. For centuries, it was no longer a living city of the Roman world, nor did it hold a clear place in the public memory of medieval or early modern Europe. It existed as a mass compressed between geology and oblivion, between pumice, hardened ash, layers of soil, and the ever-thickening silence of collective memory. The name Pompeii did not wholly vanish from culture, yet its location did not persist as a city one could enter and interpret as we do today. There were scattered encounters, incomplete contacts. In the late 16th century, the architect Domenico Fontana, while constructing a water channel, passed through this area, brushing against the buried past without transforming that contact into full archaeological recognition. Not until 1748 did work at Pompeii truly begin, and only in 1763 did an inscription discovered on site clearly confirm the name of the place. The gap between those moments forms one of the most curious voids in history, where a once crowded city of forums, baths, temples, workshops, taverns, and villas lay silent, as if cast outside the movement of the world. One might say Pompeii was buried twice, first by ash, pumice, and volcanic material from Mount Vesuvius, then by time, by the rupture of memory, by centuries during which its name was no longer called as a living presence. It is this second burial that lends its rediscovery such weight, for what returned was not merely walls and objects, but a fragment of the past thought lost from human memory. Yet that silence was not annihilation. It was closer to a deep sleep beneath the earth. If one were to alter but a single variable in this history, the image of the past might have unfolded very differently. Had there existed, in the 1st or 2nd century, Adust full descriptions of Pompeii as a city frozen beneath ash, Roman memory of the disaster might have grown denser, more concrete, less dissolved within literary responses to Vesuvius. Had the site never fallen from public awareness for centuries, European archaeology might have followed another path. For the concept of a large-scale, preserved ancient city might have emerged far earlier, perhaps early enough to reshape how time, matter, and the past were conceived. Yet there is also a quieter, deeper possibility that had Pompeii always remained known, it might not have carried the same force upon its return in the modern age. Part of its power lies in its absence, in the blindness that stretched across nearly 17 centuries, in the way it returned like an echo from a place thought entirely gone. The volcano determined the moment of collapse. Human memory determined the long fate that followed. A city does not perish only by burning ash. It may also fall into sleep when no one speaks its name for long enough. Thus Pompeii did not disappear after the eruption only to be immediately rediscovered. It passed through a prolonged aftermath, marked by return, by salvage, by disturbance, by the quiet interventions of human hands, before sinking into centuries of silence, until work at the site truly began in 1748. What was lost was not merely a city upon the surface of the earth. What was lost was the continuous telling of that city within human memory. Yet beneath the layers of soil and stone, beneath the hardened ash, beneath oblivion as heavy as a night without end, Pompeii was never entirely gone. It lay there, like a buried sleep, like a memory without voice yet still holding form, awaiting the moment when history would bend close enough to hear it once more. It would take nearly 17 centuries before the world began to hear that faint echo beneath the earth. In 1748, in the lands near Naples under the control of the Bourbon dynasty, the ground that had concealed a city for nearly 17 centuries began to yield beneath pickaxes, shovels, tunnels, and a kind of curiosity distinct to 18th century Europe, when the Greco-Roman world was no longer merely a memory preserved in texts, but an object of knowledge, of collection, and of power seeking to cloak itself in the grandeur of the past. What was awakened at first was not yet a city in any clear sense, nor a site fully recognized, but only the earliest cuts driven through the hardened volcanic layers of AD 79, as though human hands were feeling their way through a memory that had slept too long, touching fragments of stone, touching voids, touching traces not yet given names. The scene bore no mark of triumph. It was slower, quieter, like a faint stirring beneath the earth, where a place long lost to public memory did not suddenly appear, but merely began to release, grain by grain, the dust of its former life. For that slow awakening to become an organized endeavor, history required individuals of ambition, of means, of the ability to turn curiosity into sustained action across years. Within that current, Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre emerges as a figure impossible to overlook. A Spanish military engineer, he was closely tied to excavations under the Bourbon court at the Vesuvian cities, in a context where Herculaneum had already been systematically explored since 1738, and attention had begun to shift toward other lands still lying silent beneath ash and stone. When focus turned to Pompeii in 1748, the work beneath the earth ceased to be accidental encounters with ancient remains and became a sequence of actions with clearer purpose, supported by wealth, organization, and the desire to reinforce the cultural and political prestige of Naples within Europe. Antiquities were no longer mere remnants. They were symbols. They were proof that present power could reach into the majesty of the past. Yet beneath these motives, something deeper was unfolding. Pompeii had not yet truly returned, but it had begun to be heard, not by ear, but by the steady descent of tools into the earth. As excavation deepened, what emerged began to transform the picture. The year 1748 marked the beginning of work at Pompeii, yet in those early years, what appeared was not a complete discovery, not a clear map, not a city correctly named, but ordered fragments of architecture, stone walls, house foundations, spaces unfolding according to the logic of a once living environment. A single burial site could not create such a sense. A scattered collection of artifacts could not create such a sense. When an amphitheatre was recognized, when a necropolis came into view, when structures aligned into increasingly coherent patterns, those who dug began to face a truth growing before them, that what lay beneath their feet was not merely ancient objects, but the remains of an urban world. This is the peculiar beauty of that moment. The city appeared before its name did. The past did not return as a complete answer. It returned as a question, widening, deepening, growing heavier with each layer revealed. At that point, the archaeological value of Pompeii began to exceed the initial aims of 18th century excavation. Methods remained far from modern standards. Much activity still carried the spirit of seeking beautiful objects, things to display, to admire, to confer prestige upon their possessors and their patrons. By present standards, such excavation was crude, unsystematic, overlooking vast amounts of data that modern archaeology would hold essential. Yet history often unfolds through such paradox. From these imperfect beginnings, a new field of knowledge began to take form. Herculaneum, then Pompeii, compelled Europe to see antiquity differently. A wall painting was no longer merely an object of beauty. A vessel was no longer merely a precious item. A floor, a wall, a courtyard, a street, placed together, began to tell of an entire living world that once existed, once functioned, once moved according to its own rhythm. The shift from collecting objects to reading a city had already begun within those first trenches. Slowly, but decisively. Then, in 1763, the Earth yielded not only form, but identity. An inscription bearing the phrase Republicae Pompeianorum was discovered, providing direct confirmation that this site was indeed Pompeii. Before that moment, enough had been uncovered to understand that this was a large ancient space, a buried city, a living structure unmistakable from isolated tombs or anonymous ruins. But to understand scale is not the same as to speak the correct name. To know that a city lies here is not the same as knowing who it is within history. Thus 1763 carries a meaning beyond the discovery of an inscription. It is the moment a city, silent for nearly 17 centuries, spoke its own name again to the modern world. From that point onward, what was being excavated was no longer an uncertain ruin, but Pompeii, a name once belonging to Roman life, cut off from history by the volcano, now rejoined to the human timeline. This was not merely the recovery of objects, it was the restoration of voice, of identity, of presence. That moment also reveals the fragility of historical opportunity. Had the work begun in 1748 never truly taken root, had the area remained buried for centuries more beneath soil, cultivation, and forgetfulness, would Pompeii have entered global memory as it has? Had earlier encounters remained accidental, as in the case of Domenico Fontana in the late 16th century, when ancient traces were touched but not pursued through sustained excavation, the past might have flickered and vanished once more. Had the site been plundered piecemeal for materials or artifacts torn from its context, the city might have been reduced to fragments beautiful yet silent, sufficient for display but unable to tell a life. This is not a revision of history, but a recognition that heritage survives not only by burial, but by rediscovery at the right moment, by recognition in the right direction, by pursuit sustained long enough for an anonymous mass of earth to become a memory with form. Pompeii did not return in a single day, nor awaken like a door thrown open. From 1748 to 1763 it was heard again layer by layer, uncovered space by space, recognized piece by piece, until at last it was called by its true name. This turning point reshaped not only the fate of a site near Naples, but the way the modern world regards antiquity, no longer as a storehouse of rare objects, but as the remains of a real human world, of real streets, real lives. Only when excavation learned to read even the empty spaces within the ash did Pompeii truly return to the modern age the human faces that once lived beneath its sky. How could a city buried beneath ash and volcanic debris, where the human body had long since dissolved back into the earth, still preserve the form of those who once lived within it? That question only truly opened after 1863 when, within the excavated zones of Pompeii, amid layers of compacted ash hardened over centuries, archaeology began to encounter strange voids, spaces that were neither accidental nor meaningless, not merely the result of eroded material, but negative imprints of lives that had once existed. From that moment on, Pompeii was no longer seen only as a place of stone walls, frescoes, streets, or objects drawn from the soil. The city began to speak in a quieter, deeper, more painful language, the shaped absence of human beings. Within those hardened layers of ash, archaeology stood before a paradox both ancient and modern. The body was gone, yet its impression remained. Names had fallen into silence, yet posture endured. The face had vanished, yet the curve of a bowed head, a drawn arm, a body bent as if shielding something, still existed as though death could not erase the final gesture. From that fragile threshold, where emptiness ceased to be nothing and became data, Giuseppe Fiorelli entered the story, not merely as an administrator of excavations, but as one who altered, at its root, the way Pompeii would stand before the world. Born in 1823 and passing in 1896, Fiorelli belonged to a generation that moved archaeology away from the pursuit of precious artifacts or decorative fragments fit for display, toward the reading of a city as a living whole, and then as a vast record of time. His value lay not only in preserving Pompeii far more intact than earlier exploitative digging had allowed, but in understanding that the most vital evidence is not always what can be held in the hand, but what the eye first assumes is not there at all. Beginning in 1863, he became the first to successfully pour liquid plaster into those voids to recover the shapes of the victims. The act, technically simple, was, in understanding, nearly revolutionary. Fiorelli and his team realized that these voids could be filled with a liquid substance that would harden according to the form death had left within the ash. As the surrounding material was gradually removed, human figures emerged, not as mummies, not as preserved bodies, but as negative traces made tangible, presences returning from absolute absence. The moment the first cast appeared must have been among the most arresting in 19th century archaeology, for from then on, the past was no longer only walls, stone, floors, or inscriptions. The past regained a human shape. Pompeii ceased to be merely a city uncovered. It became a place where its last inhabitants were still there, in some manner silent, unmoving, yet not entirely gone. Yet one point must be made clear to avoid all misunderstanding. These casts are not petrified corpses. They are not intact bodies hardened into statues. What occurred was subtler and more haunting. When the disaster buried Pompeii, the victims' bodies were encased in volcanic material. Over time, the organic matter decayed, but the hardened ash retained the void shaped by the body once inside. Only when liquid plaster was poured into these cavities did the form become a three-dimensional model. In other words, as the cast is not the body itself, but the shape of absence, an archaeological form born from the imprint of a life no longer present. Through this, the victims of Pompeii, once reduced to anonymous numbers, began to draw nearer, to become more defined, more human. Some lie curled, as if bracing against a final force. Others are caught in the posture of an unfinished escape. Some seem to embrace themselves amid a chaos no language could fully express. There is no need to view them with horror, no need to draw them towards spectacle. To look long enough is to see that archaeology, at its deepest moments, does not uncover terror, but the final dignity of human beings before catastrophe. The quiet beauty of this story lies in how emotion does not stand opposed to science. Here, emotion endures because it rests upon truth. The casts are the result of three layers of understanding, stacked like the geological strata of human perception. First, the observation of stratigraphy, recognizing that within compacted ash lie voids that cannot be explained as random cavities. Next, an understanding of organic decay, that the body is lost, yet its form can leave behind a stable void under the right conditions. Finally, the technique of preservation, filling that void with liquid material, allowing it to harden, then removing the surrounding layers to create a three-dimensional form. These three layers, converging, achieved what once seemed impossible, turning disappearance into evidence. Later studies reveal that the story does not end with plaster and surface form. Many casts still contain skeletal remains within, meaning that behind the familiar exterior lies further layers of biological, anthropological, and chemical data waiting to be read with modern methods. Post-depositional analysis clarifies how plaster has interacted with bone, how preservation has shifted over time, and how access to information about ancient human bodies continues to expand. New technologies show that the casts are not merely objects of display that stir emotion in museums or excavation sites, but sources of biological data capable of yielding insight into those long covered by time. Science does not strip Pompeii of its silence. It brings that silence closer, more real, more profound. What lingers longest is not only the human form, but the posture of that form. A movement halted mid-course, a defensive reflex never completed, a small gesture of muscle and instinct preserved longer than houses, longer than spoken memory, longer than written history. In these casts, the modern observer sees not only death, but the moment in which life still strained to continue, if only for a second more, a single gesture more, one last tightening of the body against an unseen pressure from ski and earth. Had the casting technique never been devised, Pompeii would still stand as an exceptionally preserved ancient city in architectural terms. Its streets, floors, frescoes, bakeries, baths, courtyards, all would still tell the story of a Roman urban life nearly intact. Yet without the casts, the modern memory of Pompeii would lack the layer of evidence that allows this disaster to reach so deeply into human compassion. There would be no final postures to arrest the gaze, no forms to remind us that beneath the ash once stood a breathing person, afraid, striving to live one moment longer. Pompeii would remain a rare ancient city. Through the casts, it becomes something else entirely, a place where archaeology does not only recover objects, but restores presence to the lost. Some inventions deepen knowledge, some transform method, others are quieter, yet reach into the deepest layers of human memory, because they return the past from abstraction into experience, with a face, a posture, a familiar fragility. Fiorelli's belongs to this last kind. He did not make death easier to behold. He made the life that had once existed there impossible to deny. At its most profound moment, archaeology does not merely find objects, nor only the evidence of a vanished civilization. It finds the human being. Through Fiorelli and the casting technique, Pompeii moves from a city uncovered to a city in which its last inhabitants can still be seen, not through names, not through biography, but through the fragile forms they left within hardened ash. That is the singular value that places Fiorelli in a distinct position within the history of Pompeii, for he did not only preserve ruins, but opened a way for the past to recover a human face. Yet Pompeii does not speak only of an ending. New discovery suggests something quieter, that after the tragedy, someone once returned, lit a fire, baked bread, and attempted to live again among what remained. On August 11th, 2025, within a city studied across generations, a new announcement from the Pompeii archaeological site revealed something at once small and immense, like a thin beam of light emerging through the dense ash of a story long thought complete. For many years, the familiar image of Pompeii remained that of a place destroyed in 79 AD and then sunk into silence. A city halted in its final moment, leaving behind only death, burial, and archaeological memory. Yet at Insula Meridionalis, new data suggest that this history is neither flat nor sealed, neither concluded in the orderly way human narratives often prefer. After centuries of excavation, documentation, and interpretation, modern archaeology has uncovered another layer, deeper than habit itself, a post-catastrophe history once overlooked, blurred, nearly absent from the common story of Pompeii. This discovery does not overturn the entire past. It corrects a single assumption long taken as certain, that after the eruption, all signs of life vanished immediately. What makes this finding compelling is not any romantic notion of rebirth, but the quiet, grounded, material evidence, things that do not proclaim, yet shift history ever so slightly. At Insula Meridionalis, once thought fully claimed by a sealed past, archaeologists have found traces of rebuilding or reuse after 79 AD. Not grand constructions, not restored forums, not the triumphant return of a Roman city, but far more modest signs, closer to daily rhythm than to monument. There are ovens, there are traces of cooking, there is pottery, there is reused marble, there are interventions in space that show this place was not merely observed from afar as ruin, but touched again, used again, occupied again by human hands after the disaster. Here, the difference in telling becomes crucial. It cannot be said that Pompeii returned to life as before, nor should it be called a full recovery of the city. A more faithful expression is that there were signs of localized reoccupation or reuse, meaning that within a city dead as a whole, there remained small spaces not entirely surrendered to nothingness. An oven set among ruins is not the triumph of civilization. A shard of post-disaster pottery is not proof of restored life. Yet these small objects reveal something deeper, that after the catastrophe, at some moment, someone returned, perhaps to shelter, perhaps to salvage what remained, perhaps simply to survive within a broken world. A city dead, in absolute terms, becomes instead a city with a lingering echo of life. Archaeology, at its most refined, has never been only the science of objects. It is the science of sequences of living. An oven is not merely a structure for fire. It is proof that fire was once needed. A layer of pottery is not merely material residue. It is the rhythm of eating, storing, using, and leaving behind. A modified wall, a space reassigned, an old material removed and set into a new context. All these together form what archaeologists read as one might read the faint pulse within a body thought long stilled. When researchers say this discovery restores a part of history once erased, they mean that earlier excavations, however vast, may have passed too quickly over the post-catastrophe layer, captivated by the moment of destruction, not lingering long enough to see what followed. Thus, the significance of this finding extends far beyond the objects themselves. It corrects the overly simple linear model that Pompeii ended instantly and was abandoned forever. The picture now becomes more intricate. A city may die as a large structure, yet within it, fragments of space may still be returned to, inhabited again in small, local, fragile ways, like faint embers glowing in cold ash. The value of Pompeii is not diminished. It deepens, for the city reveals not only Roman life before disaster, but also how human beings may find a way back after history seems closed. It is within those who returned that the post-catastrophe layer of Pompeii becomes most delicate. There are no certain names to call them, no faces clearly reconstructed, no chronicle recording who returned, how long they stayed, or when they left. There are only traces, materials, what hands once left behind. Yet history is often most intimate where names are absent. They may have been survivors. They may have been people who had lost nearly everything, for whom the ruins were no longer the greatest fear. They may have been later arrivals, without direct memory of the city before the eruption, yet who saw in broken walls and leftover materials the possibility of a small life. They did not rebuild Pompeii as it was. They did not restore theatres or forums. They did not summon memory in its full former grandeur. They left only signs of the ordinary, using a space, placing an oven, touching old material, giving it a new function, letting fire burn where once a greater fire had destroyed. In that contrast lies a deep quiet. On one side, a catastrophe capable of erasing a city. On the other, a life so small that an oven, a shard. A minor repair is enough to be recognized. Not a glorious rebirth, only survival, yet a real survival. And sometimes that alone is enough to alter the entire tone of the story. From here, the question is no longer whether Pompeii lived again, for that question remains too large, too rigid, too demanding of a complete answer. A gentler, truer question would be how many ways a place may continue after it has been declared finished. If within the grey ash someone once returned to light a fire, to touch old walls, to set a rhythm of living again, even as a faint shadow of the past, then Pompeii is not only a city that was killed, it is also a place that carried brief, local, quiet forms of life after catastrophe. Had archaeology not delved deeply enough into post-disaster layers, perhaps even now humanity would still believe a simpler, easier story, that everything ended immediately and forever. History is rarely so neat. It preserves blurred traces, interruptions, continuations so small that only patience reveals them. A city may lose its power, its population, its place in the world, yet that does not mean all forms of life vanish at once. Sometimes what remains longest is not the old order, but the human instinct to find shelter, to light a fire, to turn a devastated place into a temporary space of living once more. Thus archaeology does not only uncover the past, it corrects the oversimplified stories the present once believed sufficient. The discovery announced in 2025 at Insula Meridionalis does not lessen the tragedy of Pompeii, nor soften the disaster of 79 AD. What it does is extend the depth of time within a single place, showing that after the most famous moment of destruction, there remained other moments, quieter, smaller, less noticed, yet no less real. A city once thought entirely ended now appears as an entity with an afterlife, with reverberations, with late folds only patient archaeology can trace. Pompeii has not finished telling its story. Nearly 2 millennia have passed, yet the ash has not spoken all. The silent walls have not yielded all memory. Modern science continues to dig, not only into the ground, but into what humanity once believed it already knew. If a place so thoroughly studied can still surprise, then perhaps other secrets of Pompeii remain nearby, very close, very quiet, beneath the same ash history once thought it had fully read. The Pompeii of today does not open with a distant memory, but with daylight falling into newly opened trenches, with wall surfaces just emerging from the ash that kept them silent for nearly 2,000 years, with the edges of floors, courtyards, and unfinished plaster appearing before archaeologists like ancient sentences buried mid-phrase and suddenly read again. In the 2020s, the dominant feeling this city evokes is no longer simple awe before a famous ruin, but a slower, deeper, almost paradoxical awareness Pompeii, a place that seems so familiar to history and archaeology, has in fact not finished telling its story. Newly uncovered areas in Regio 9, especially Insula 10, show that modern archaeology is no longer seeking only what is beautiful, intact, or easily displayed, but is learning to read this city as a sequence of interrupted actions, where walls remain unfinished, building materials lie in place, surfaces remain incomplete, and traces of labour are preserved exactly as the catastrophe encountered them. It is there that Pompeii appears not as a framed image, but as a place still responding to the questions of the present. It is there that an ancient city begins to resemble a living archive. From that modern scene, one example rises with almost symbolic weight. At Domus 910-1 in Regio 9, research published in 2025 describes a Roman construction site preserved in situ, a house still undergoing repair or completion at the exact moment. The eruption of AD 79 halted all movement. Samples taken from walls already built, walls still rising, and piles of dry raw materials lying beside the work area create a scene so rare it is almost impossible to repeat. What is preserved here is not merely the final result of architecture, but the rhythm of work still in progress. An unfinished wall, a surface left half plastered, a floor in the midst of completion, a pile of materials still resting where it would have been used the next day, or that very afternoon, had history not closed so abruptly. From these details, researchers do not only read what was built, but how it was being built, in what sequence, through what gestures. The anonymous builders of AD 79 no longer have names, voices, or faces, yet they remain present in that interrupted rhythm of labour, as though their hands had only just left the material when the hot ash arrived. The climax of this discovery lies precisely in that realization. Pompeii does not only preserve what was finished, but also what was left unfinished. It does not preserve only the product, it preserves the process. Because it is unfinished, that construction site becomes more valuable than many completed structures that reveal only the final surface of architecture. A finished wall often conceals the intermediate steps that created it, whereas a site still under construction opens the entire chain of actions that time usually erases elsewhere. The scientific value of this discovery lies in that subtle point. Researchers can directly observe the materials being used, the preparation of layers, the sequence of finishing surfaces, and the technical gestures that typically disappear once a structure is completed. Microstructural and chemical analysis at this site indicates that, in the case of the binding material, quicklime was mixed first with dry pozzolan before water was added, a detail of great importance because it reflects actual construction practice on site, rather than a reconstruction based on theory. what must be stated with precision is that this discovery does not mean all the secrets of Roman concrete have been fully decoded at Pompeii. Its true significance lies in the fact that Pompeii provides exceptionally valuable field evidence of construction techniques, binding materials, and building processes, thereby deepening broader understanding of ancient engineering. A buried city suddenly becomes a place that can teach modern science how to look at each stage of a technique once thought lost. Beyond architecture, recent studies of the Vesuvian region also show that its unique burial conditions have preserved far more fragile traces, from landscapes to vegetation, to layers of evidence that rarely survive elsewhere. When a city can preserve both an unfinished construction process and the delicate remnants of its environment, it ceases to be merely a ruin. It becomes an archive waiting to be read. From that unfinished construction site, the picture of 2025 expands into other spaces, and each new discovery seems to shift the city slightly within modern understanding. On February 26th, 2025 at Insula 10 in Region 9, a large fresco with nearly life-sized figures was revealed in a banquet hall, opening new connections to the symbolic and Dionysiac world within Pompeian culture. The value of this discovery lies not simply in the beauty of the painting, but in its ability to extend layers of social, religious, and symbolic meaning from wall surfaces long thought to have been fully read by history. Shortly before that, early 2025 reports also revealed a luxurious private villa with an extensive bath complex and banquet rooms, in which part of the structure was still undergoing renovation at the time of the eruption. Placed side by side, these two discoveries form a powerful image. Pompeii is not a stage where the curtain has fallen, leaving only props behind. It is a city still in motion in its final moment, still building, still repairing, still decorating, still preparing for banquets, for gatherings, for a life assumed to continue. Each layer of ash not yet removed, therefore, does not merely conceal an artifact, but may still hold a fragment of knowledge untouched by human hands. The most resonant moment of this section lies there. Pompeii does not only preserve what is complete, it preserves what is ongoing. That incompleteness brings the city closer, makes it more alive, and also more painful, because what appears before the eye is not only a world that once existed, but a world cut off mid-sentence. From here, a natural layer of reflection unfolds. If tomorrow, beneath an unexcavated wall, another workshop, a kitchen, a room under repair, or a previously unknown technical detail of Roman life were to appear, would that truly change the story? Perhaps it would. Perhaps not in a dramatic way. For what is most valuable in Pompeii today lies not in the promise of a shocking secret, but in the possibility that each remaining layer of ash can refine present understanding, correct an old assumption, clarify a blurred technique, revive a rhythm of life once lost within the gaps of historical records. If Pompeii is not a completed story, but an archive still opening its drawers very slowly, then each excavation is not simply the recovery of an object, but the touching of an unfinished question. The more is known about this city, the clearer one paradox becomes: much remains untouched. Knowledge here does not close with the fame of the site. It grows with what has yet to be read. For that reason, modern science does not make the story of Pompeii less poetic. It makes it deeper. From the unfinished construction site in Reggio 9 to the discoveries of 2025, The city appears not as a sealed past, but as a historical laboratory still being read through new questions, new methods, new technologies. The value of Pompeii today lies not only in the ancient tragedy preserved beneath ash, but also in its ongoing capacity to nurture archaeology, material science, environmental research, heritage conservation, an increasingly refined understanding of Roman life. Perhaps that is why Pompeii has never been merely a field of ruins. It is a memory that still breathes faintly beneath the ash, preserving not only death, but life, labour, and time. From a D79 to the present, Pompeii exists in a state unlike most cities that have disappeared from history. It is not merely the site of a past disaster, nor simply an archaeological location under the southern Italian sun, but a space of memory where time does not seem to move in the usual way. Elsewhere, the past often reaches the present in fragments, a surviving wall, a broken inscription, a foundation exposed beneath the soil. At Pompeii, the past appears as something larger, almost retaining the structural rhythm of life itself, with streets, houses, decorated walls, courtyards, traces of daily activity, and even the empty spaces that modern observers must learn to read as a silent language. For this reason, by the end of this journey, Pompeii no longer stands as a backdrop through which the story passes. It becomes the central character, a figure that does not speak with a voice but through stone, through ash, through worn road surfaces marked by wheels, through rooms now empty yet still holding the shape of the life once lived within them. When seen in its entirety, the first sensation need not be sorrow. It may be openness, light, a quiet respect for the strange ability of matter to hold time in trust. Pompeii resembles an archive built not by libraries or manuscripts, but by catastrophe itself. The city was frozen in its final moment, yet that very stillness compressed layers of life, preserved them, and left them waiting to be read. Time here did not vanish. It was pressed thin, compacted, and left to rest within ash for centuries, so that when it was opened again, it still carried the form of a Roman city with rare completeness. For that reason, the people who once lived here never fully disappeared from the story. They no longer walk upon the stone slabs, yet the imprint of their lives remains in every space, every object, every small trace that only a truly inhabited place could produce. It is at this point that Pompeii becomes one of the most extraordinary places in the world to see Roman life not at the level of symbol, but at the level of the ordinary. Most ancient cities leave behind temples, columns, foundations, structures large enough to endure time, yet too grand to speak for everyday rhythms. Pompeii is different because what remains is not only the most formal aspect of civilization, but also its most intimate. There are paved streets that still retain the flow of an active city. There are gardens, frescoes, houses, public spaces, markets, meeting places, theatres, halls of civic authority, and bakeries where flour was once kneaded into food for a new day. There are writings on walls, traces too small to seem survivable, yet enduring long enough to reveal that this place once held voices, transactions, humour, advertisements, and the small, scattered thoughts that define human life. Pompeii haunts not only because of how it was lost, but because of how ordinary it was before that loss. A city does not become unforgettable simply because it died in catastrophe. It becomes unforgettable because it once lived in a way that was specific, earthly, and human. Thus, when looking at Pompeii today, what appears is not only ash, but the rhythm of life that ash has inadvertently preserved. In those rooms there were once meals. Along those streets there were footsteps. Behind those doorways there were days repeated, small tasks carried out, plans that no one expected would be interrupted. The exceptional preservation of the city brings the past down from the distance of monuments, close enough that ancient civilization no longer feels abstract. It once had the smell of fire, light cast upon painted walls, the sound of trade, the breath of a city that knew it was alive, unaware that it was approaching its final day. Yet the value of Pompeii does not end with presenting a complete image of a lost life. Modern science deepens it further, as though each layer of ash removed reveals another layer of meaning. Pompeii is no longer confined within the simple narrative of a city destroyed by a volcano. It becomes an interdisciplinary body of data where volcanology, archaeology, conservation science, material study, environmental research, and the study of daily life converge upon a single site. There, one does not only read what was destroyed, but what was being built, what was being repaired, what remained unfinished at the very moment history closed its door. An unfinished construction site in Regio 9 reveals not only the form of a structure, but the process of building, the materials in use, the rhythm of labour in motion, and then abruptly halted. This transforms Pompeii from a static image of a final result into a cross-section of a living process. In the same way, studies of vegetation and landscape in the Vesuvian region show that the unique burial conditions preserved not only walls and objects, but far more fragile layers of data. A city, after all, is not made of stone alone. It is made of plants, food, environment, habits, and the exchange between architecture and the natural world around it. When those layers remain readable, Pompeii opens before science as a living world with ecological depth, urban structure, construction techniques, communal behaviour, and human responses to a natural force beyond control. Science does not make the city less poetic, nor less sorrowful. It makes it deeper, for through science, one can understand not only what was lost, but how it was built, how it was used, how it functioned, and how abruptly it was cut off. The sorrow is no longer only the sorrow of death, it is the sorrow of a life interrupted. At the meeting point of data and memory, Pompeii extends beyond archaeology into modern consciousness. From the 18th century onward, discoveries at Pompeii and other Vesuvian sites reshaped European taste, aesthetics, and historical imagination. Antiquity was no longer a distant idea known only through texts or scholarly tradition. It appeared before the eyes as a world that could be seen, walked through, almost touched. Pompeii thus became not only a legacy of ancient Rome, but a cultural symbol, a place where the past enters the modern mind with a presence both intimate and unreachable. Each layer of story in this journey, from daily life to the towering ash cloud, from frantic flight to bodies preserved in hardened voids, from early excavations to modern research, gathers into an enduring sense of haunting. That haunting does not lie in the disaster alone. Disaster, by itself, is not enough to sustain memory across centuries. The deeper resonance lies in a greater paradox: a city destroyed, yet more visible than many that continued to live. Other places survive by constant change, by building over the old, by erasing traces of yesterday, leaving their past buried in layers difficult to reach. Pompeii is different. It ended too early, too violently, too suddenly, so that a vast portion of its life was never erased by the normal passage of time. The city was killed by nature, yet preserved from the slow erosion that surviving cities endure. That is what makes it a singular mirror, where the present can look into the past more closely, more clearly, and more painfully than usual. By this point, the final question no longer belongs to the direction of wind or the speed of pyroclastic flow, but to the way humanity understands its own civilization. Each step along those stone streets may serve as a quiet reminder that every city, no matter how wealthy, how crowded, how enduring it appears, lives within a fragile balance with the natural world. What Pompeii leaves behind may not only be archaeological knowledge or scientific data, but a silent lesson about time, impermanence, and the limits of what human beings build through labour, belief, and intellect. Perhaps Pompeii reaches into the present not because it is ancient, but because it forces recognition that all civilizations are both resilient and fragile at once. A city may endure across generations, accumulating wealth, art, law, habit, and stable rhythms that seem unchanging. Yet in a single day, that balance may shift. In a single day, nature may remind humanity that its continuity is always a negotiation, never a guarantee. Yet Pompeii does not compel fear. It invites understanding, not through harsh warning, nor through heavy philosophy, but through its silent presence. A wall remains, a road remains, a courtyard remains, a city lost, yet still able to speak through what endures. From there, everything settles slowly, like a final thin layer of ash descending into memory. The deepest moment of Pompeii lies in an inseparable paradox. The catastrophe that destroyed the city also preserved it as a material memory unlike any other. Ash killed the city. Ash preserved its memory. Pompeii is therefore not only a place that has been lost, it is a place still speaking softly to the present, reminding that some things are seen most clearly only after they are gone, that civilizations reveal their deepest layers when they reach their limits, and that nature, in its most violent moment, may become the most faithful keeper of human memory,